The Pencaros and the Trefusis families had been wrecking ships on the Cornish coast for as long as any of them could remember, generation after generation after generation. And so perhaps it came as no great surprise to anyone that eventually the Pencaro family should unite with the Trefusis family in marriage and produce a batch of sons who were perhaps the most prolific wreckers in the whole of either family's history. And it was certainly the case that Mrs. Pencaro, the mother of this particular brood, now many a year widowed, kept her ear close to the gossip that went round the pubs down the coastal parts of those stretches of Cornish coast. And so it was in time that she heard tell that the Morgellon was due to birth a week hence, with a considerable supply of all manner of interesting goods, not least the takings in gold of the merchant who had commissioned the Morgellon to sail him and his family back from their trading in Holland. Knowing the dates of the Morgellon's arrival, late one evening, an ideal time for wrecking, Mrs. Pencaro and her sons set out upon the coastal path, miles out from the nearest settlement, and there they took their lanterns and they held them aloft upon the coast as the mists grew thicker and thicker and thicker. Ideal weather for wrecking ships. So the only lights the unfortunate captain of that ship would see would be their own, and think himself coming close to land, which he was, but not land that was safe to berth upon. And so Mrs. Pencaro and her two sons, Jory and Petrach, steered those sailors, that unfortunate ship, those merchants that were upon the ship, away from safe harbour and to wreck upon the jagged rocks that were close to the coast in that particular stretch of a lonely Cornish beach. They stood upon the cliffs, and through the mists, the thick sea mists, they watched, or heard them watched, the sounds of the ship wrecking upon the great jagged rocks that protruded from the ocean. They heard the screams of distant sailors. They heard the cracking of the great mast. They heard the collapse of the rigs, the sails falling down, soaked by the sea mists, smothering the sailors and the merchants upon the ships. They heard all of that, the grief, the fear, the death, and all they could think of was the profit to be had when barrels of cargo would wash up upon the shores, and they would be able to swarm down onto the beaches and grab them and cart them away on the back of horse and cart before any of the authorities came to find out what had happened to that unfortunate ship that had never made the berth that it was due to make in the docks 5 miles down. Dark times and dark methods to make money. When the screaming stopped, Mrs. Pencaro directed her two sons down onto the beach, she herself waddling up, slow now in late middle age, as fast as she could behind them. Her two big burly sons scouting hither and yon, lifting their lanterns as they went, searching for any sign of cargo washed ashore. They found the first of the bodies, some sailor drowned at sea, not having made it off the rocks as his ship had crashed into them, blue-faced, dead-eyed, staring up into oblivion in the heavens. But next to him, they also found a barrel, and they were soon away with that onto the back of the wagon that was stationed but half a mile further up the coastal path. And then they found great lengths of rope, they found bits of this and bits of that, things that would have some salvage value, not always what they were hoping for, but some salvage value. that they ferreted away onto the back of their cart, ready to take away with them. But look as they might, they could find no sign or sound of the wealth in gold that was meant to be aboard this ship. But then gold, as Mrs. Pencarrow pointed out, her sons, would sink down, not wash ashore. It was too heavy to wash ashore. They would have to go out onto the rocks by daylight and search before the revenue men turned up to claim the wreckage of the ship, which was why, of course, they had wrecked the ship in this particular part of the coast rather than further down, because here not only were they a good few miles from the nearest habitation, but if the ship had wrecked in the exact spot they hoped it had, it wouldn't sink completely down, it would be caught upon the rocks. And so whatever hefty cargo, the heavier stuff, particularly the gold that they might want to get off the ship, they might, if, well, not so much God was with them, but maybe a more infernal force was with them, that cargo would be trapped still upon the ship, not yet having sunk into oblivion beneath the waves. And whilst Petrock could hold his breath longer than most, if it had sunk too far down, the chances of him being able to swim down deep enough to get it on a single breath and come back up again were minimal, to say the least. But even as they were discussing this, the damp mist soaking into their clothes, even as they were ferreting around for the last of the cargo that had been washed ashore, they heard the distant crack of thunder. They saw the distant flash of lightning as the storm began out to sea. And there they were, carrying their lamps and their cargo up back to the cliff path, trying to find their way in the darkness and the mist and the fog, trying to find their way up to the horse and cart before the storm rolled in from the sea into land and really drenched them. And they only just made it to the horse and cart itself when the first of the rain began to drop inland, heavier and heavier and heavier, such that by the time they'd made that long journey home to their cottage, all three of them were drenched to the skin, were wringing their clothes out by the fireplace when they got inside, and hoping that none of them would catch their death of the cold and the wet and the rain. That night they shivered and huddled by the fire, stoking it up as best they could, and trying to reassure themselves that it had been worth the risk to them and to their health to be caught out in this terrible storm, which raged and raged all through the night, all into the next day, so heavy, so relentless that none of them dared go out in it, even at the risk of possibly losing the very thing that they had wrecked that ship for. And the next day, and the next day, 3 days and 3 nights of relentless, heavy rain, until finally, at dawn on the 4th day, the storm broke. And whilst it was still damp and as thick mud underfoot as you can possibly imagine, nonetheless, if they were going to raid the ship, they had to do it then, because if they were able to get out in the brief lull in the storm, then maybe so would the revenue men, so would the people expecting that ship to berth and looking for it up and down the length of the coast as to what might have happened to it. And they had to get there before the authorities did, otherwise there would be no prize left to claim. And so Mrs. Pencarrow sent her 2 sons out, for she herself was past the age where she wanted to go out after 3 nights of relentless rain. She sent them out, Jory and Petrock, to claim what they could, and off the 2 big burly brothers went, down to the place where they tied the horse and cart, onto the beach itself, across the shingle and pebbles, slipping and sliding, for they were as wet could be. And there they could see out to sea, by the early dawn light, what was left of the unfortunate Morgellon ship, which was by this time not a lot. Masts shattered, the sea smashing and crashing against the ship for days now as the storm raged and raged and raged. But there was enough of the ship left that they had hopes that perhaps the gold would still be on that ship, and maybe there would be a few other prizes to be had as well. and they had their little rowboat with them that they'd had put on the back of the horse and cart and then brought down to the beach with them. And so the two brothers set out, sailing and rowing out to the rocks, knowing that part of the coast well enough that they could swerve their little rowboat in between the various jagged rocks and not fall foul as the ship had fallen foul of the deadly stones themselves. And at length they came abreast, having seen bodies floating in the water, days dead, gradually saponificating, turning to soap in the soaking waters of the ocean, nibbled at by fish, and who knew what else. But they came abreast the wreckage of the Morgellin itself, and there they saw barrels and chests floating and bobbing, treasures here and treasures there, and they hauled as much up into the little rowboat as they dare without overloading it. And there was the main hulk of the ship itself, badly damaged now, split almost completely into one half, looking as if it might sink into the depths of the ocean wave at any moment. Onto the ship the two brothers clambered, as close as they dared, working their way across the sodden deck, ropes lashing them in the wind, for even though the storm had died down, there was still that strong wind blowing. And they saw a barrel of this and a chest of that and snatched it up and added it to their booty. But none of those chests had the heaviness of gold inside it. So on and on they looked, the boat creaking, groaning beneath them, terrifying them that it might crack up and sink at any moment. And of course the weight of the ship dragging down into the waters, even good swimmers such as themselves might not be able to fight against such power, sucking them down into the depths of the ocean wave. They were literally taking their lives into their hands as they went upon the wreckage. And there they saw, on the part of the ship that was tilted dangerously into the water, looking as if it might sink at any second, there they saw a particularly big chest, the kind of chest which, if they had to imagine where they themselves would store gold, it would be in such a chest, for it had hefty locks upon it. And slumped next to the chest was the body of a large man who, from his dress, might well have been the captain of this ship, whom they know to have been Captain Madden, from the talk of the local town, when their mother had been scouting out information about this ship. He was submerged half in the water, his boots sticking up in the air, his top half, his head and chest, sunk so deep into the wave that now they were covered, smothered in seaweed, clinging to him almost the way seaweed will cling to a rock, bladderwrack attaching itself, gripping on for grim death. Closer and closer they got to the chest, all the time the creak, the groan, the sway of the ship, reminding them of how close it was to cracking completely separately into disappearing beneath the wave forevermore, taking not only the dead captain, but their treasure and possibly them with it. They got to the chest. They rattled the lid, but it was obviously locked. Was there a key? Who would have the key? Perhaps the merchants aboard the ship who had presumably drowned along with the ship itself. Maybe someone waiting for the ship on the docks, wondering where it had got to. Maybe they would have the key. Maybe the body of the captain itself would have the key in a pocket or around the neck. So one of the brothers, Petroc, went up to the body to search on what they assumed was the captain, judging from his dress. Into the sodden pockets he delved a hand, squelching and filthy and rank, and coming out with sand and tiny little crabs crawling everywhere, for the body had been in the water all of that time. And there was clear signs that fish and crabs and whatever else had been chewing and feasting upon the bloating flesh. When the fingers of Petroc closed upon something metal in one of the pockets of the waistcoat. What was it? Was it a key? If it was a key, was it the key to this chest or to some other one? And he was so busy drawing the key out and examining it, and it was indeed a key, that he called to his brother and said, "Is this the one? Is this the one?" That he had not noticed the movement in the bloated body, sloshing in the seawater. Up it stood, slowly, but surely. A blue-grey hand, soft and sodden with water, reaching out to touch Petrock upon the shoulder, making him jump and scream like a schoolgirl as he swung round and he saw the corpse of the captain stood before him, a great morass of seaweed draping down over head and shoulders. And he began to scream and scream and scream. And his brother Draugr turned round and joined in the screaming to see the horror standing before them, blindly reaching out hands, grasping at Petrock, who backed away, and more by instinct than bravery, lashed out, his fist sinking into the head of the captain, or at least sinking into the space where a head ought to have been. For as his fist went through that seaweed morass, it came out the other side, having made no contact with jaw or with skull or with nose, nothing but a morass of seaweed, slobbering and slimy. And as much as Petrock tried to pull his fist back out, screaming and hollering, the seaweed seemed to wrap itself around his arm and slither and slide up towards his own head, covering him, smothering him, pouring into his mouth, pouring up his nose into his ears, choking him, and as he pulled away, staggering, slipping and sliding, his boots giving way on the sodden deck, still the morass of seaweed flooded from the space where the captain's head should be, consuming Petrock as his brother screamed and screamed and screamed until Petrock was no more, but another corpse in the water. And as Draugr stood and staggered around to the other side of the chest, no longer thinking of it as his chief prize, but rather now as a barrier, as a defence between him and this thing, this creature, this ghost, this whatever it was. He saw on the other side of the chest, staring up at him, a severed human head. Perhaps the very head of the captain whose body and seaweed mass now lurched and staggered towards him, arms blindly out groping, aiming towards the sound of the screeching and the screaming, the crying. Draugr snatched at the chest, now more thinking to throw it at the lumbering figure rather than to make off with the contents of it. But the chest was awfully heavy, so heavy as if it contained a fortune in gold, that he could barely pick it up by himself. He could have done with his brother there to help heave the chest up into the air and lob it at this staggering figure, except, of course, his brother was now sprawled dead upon the deck, himself little more than fish food in the waiting. And so Draugr dropped the chest, and it shattered the deck beneath it, the sodden, broken deck, and lay half tilted, half in, half out of the deck itself. And he scrabbled and ran and tried to make his way around the outer part of the deck to avoid this lumbering, staggering, undead captain that was coming after him, slow as could be, but sure and certain in his footsteps, the way a sailor will be even on the most rolling of decks, whereas Draugr slipped and slid and fell and crawled himself back up, holding on to what was left of the shattered mast, and fell again and crawled upon hands and knees across the slippery, sodden, salty deck to get back onto the more stable half of the boat. And this he did, and just did, as the great creak and crack of the ship itself broke into the waters, swirling around, drawing that half of the ship down, drawing the chest of gold or whatever its contents were down into the depths of the ocean, drawing, and he gave thanks to St. Piran and to anyone else he could think of to give thanks to, drawing the figure of the sea captain down into the great slurping swell of water as that half of the ship disappeared beneath beneath the ocean wave, and Draugr clung on to the safer, more stable half that was fixed rigid between the great jagged rocks that had been its doom. And he sobbed and he gasped, his lungs raw, and realised, of course, that not only had the corpse of this not quite dead enough captain disappeared into the waves, but the corpse of his own brother had gone into the waves too. And he thought of how he would explain this to his mother, who had already lost her husband and now her eldest son. And barely had he stopped thinking of this than a hand emerged from the waves and grasped on to his boot. A bloated, dead hand. And then another hand came up and grasped onto the deck, and even as Draugr pulled himself away, screaming and howling, he saw that seaweed-headed thing emerge from the waves, waves so powerful it had sucked down the entirety of the ship, half, but not powerful enough to suck this thing down, which crawled above the wave and came for him. Draugr turned tail. He scrambled, slipped, slithered, slid across the deck, trying to find where his own little rowboat was still moored, the rope tied around the jagged rocks. When he slipped one last time, fell, half landed in his rowboat, and half landed upon the jagged rocks themselves, so jagged that they slashed into him as surely as they had slashed into the ship all those days earlier. Blood gouted from him. He could feel his life essence dripping away into the ocean wave itself, and the cry of the seagulls above him in the bright morning air, the smell of the salt in his nostrils, of the brine that was still lapping around his boots, drawing him down and down, even as he tried to scrabble onto the boat, hopeful that if he could only make it home, then his mother might be able to patch the wounds, stitch them, do something, redeem what was left of his life. But even as he struggled and scrabbled and scrabbled and struggled, he felt the clammy hand upon his neck, and then another, and then he felt no more. Mrs. Pencarrow, meanwhile at home, waited hour upon hour upon hour for the return of her sons and their ill-gotten gains. She knew they were lazy and bone-idle. She had told them many a time that they were, and so she didn't expect them to rush, but given how likely it was that the authorities would be searching for the ship up and down the length of the coast, they really ought to be making more haste. And at length she heard the clop of the horses' hooves, the rattle of the cart wheels approaching the house. And she gave thanks to whatever it was that she gave thanks to, that her sons had finally gotten themselves home, and she hoped that they would indeed have a decent cargo. The gold itself, oh, would that not be the crowning glory of her long career as a wrecker? And if not the gold, then at least a goodly haul from the wrecked ship of its ill-gotten cargo. And she lurched towards the door as fast as her twisted hip could carry her, and flung the door open, and there indeed was the horse, and there the cart, and there in the afternoon sun descending from the back of the cart was a figure, dressed not, she realised within moments, the way either of her sons had been dressed when they left to go down to the coast that very morning. And for a horrible moment she thought it might be one of the revenue men, although they were not dressed, this figure was not dressed in the revenue outfit, but for a horrible moment she thought it might be, as the figure stepped down heavily onto the grass, as if carrying some great burdensome weight. And the figure swung round, and she saw at first the great burdensome weight it was carrying, all by itself without aid from anyone else, that great chest from off the ship. And it dropped the chest before her, and the lid sprung open, for the wood was now half rotten. and she saw inside the glint of gold, and a great smile spread across her face before she looked up to see which of her sons this was and why they were dressed in somebody else's clothes. And she too began to scream and scream and scream as she saw the seaweed morass where a head should be, and the figure began to lurch towards her, great blind hands stretching out that had once been holding that chest of gold, and the seaweed unfurling itself from around the head and the neck and stretching its green tentacles towards her, the tendrils cold and wet and salty spreading across her face, down her throat, up her nostrils, into her eyes, into her ears, smothering the life from Mrs. Pencarrow. The wages of a lifetime of wrecking finally paid. Happy Halloween.